Your Honor, I have evidence that will change everything about this case. The words cut through the packed courtroom like lightning through storm clouds. Attorney Saracen stood tall, her hands gripping a manila folder that seemed to pulse with hidden power. In the gallery, Rosa Martinez clutched her grandson's trembling hand, her weathered face etched with hope and fear in equal measure. Across the aisle, Victoria Sterling sat rigid, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the polished table, confidence radiating from every angle of her designer suit. But just 12 hours earlier, this same courtroom had witnessed a very different scene. Victoria's voice had dripped with manufactured sympathy as she testified about the difficult decision to evict an elderly woman and child from her home. Now, something had shifted. The air crackled with tension as Saracen prepared to unveil a truth so shocking it would shatter everything the court thought it knew about this family. This is the story of how greed, manipulation, and cold calculation collided with love, justice, and the unbreakable bond between a grandmother and her grandson. What happened next would expose not just a web of lies, but the lengths some people will go to steal what was never theirs. If this story of family betrayal and hidden truth resonates with you, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You might find others nearby who understand this struggle too. It began on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in November, when the sound of heavy footsteps on the front porch of 1247 Maple Street shattered Rosa Martinez's peaceful routine. She had been preparing breakfast for her grandson Marcus, humming softly while scrambling eggs, when the sharp rap of knuckles against wood echoed through the modest two-bedroom house she had called home for 30 years. Rosa paused, wooden spoon suspended mid-stir. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by the metallic click of a key turning in the lock. Her heart lurched. Only 2 people had keys to this house, herself and Victoria, her late son's widow. But Victoria had never used her key unannounced, had never even visited unless David insisted. The front door swung open with a groan of hinges that seemed to mirror Rosa's growing unease. Victoria Sterling stepped across the threshold like she owned the place, which, Rosa would soon learn, Victoria believed she did. Behind her came 2 men in dark uniforms, their faces professionally blank, clipboards tucked under their arms. "Victoria?" Rosa called, wiping her hands on her floral apron as she emerged from the kitchen. "What's going on? Who are these men?" Victoria's blue eyes, once warm during her courtship with David, now held the cold clarity of winter ice. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her charcoal business suit gave her the appearance of someone conducting a corporate takeover rather than visiting family. She didn't return Rosa's tentative smile. "Rosa," Victoria said, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone delivering bad news. "We need to talk. These gentlemen are from the sheriff's department." She gestured toward the uniformed men, who nodded politely but remained silent. "I'm afraid there's been a legal matter that needs immediate attention." From the hallway came the soft pad of bare feet on hardwood. Marcus appeared, still in his pajamas, his dark eyes wide with curiosity and growing concern. At 12 years old, he had already learned to read the tension in adults' voices, a skill no child should need to master. His backpack sat by the door, ready for another day at Jefferson Middle School, where he maintained a perfect attendance record and a 3.8 GPA despite the upheaval that had rocked his young life. "Abuela?" Marcus whispered, using the Spanish endearment that always made Rosa's heart swell. "What's happening?" Rosa moved protectively toward her grandson, one weathered hand finding his shoulder. "I don't know, Mijo." Victoria was just about to explain. But Victoria had already begun pulling documents from her leather briefcase, spreading them across Rosa's coffee table with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. The papers looked official, stamped with seals and signatures that Rosa's tired eyes couldn't quite focus on in her growing panic. As David's legal widow and sole beneficiary, Victoria began, her words sharp and precise, "I inherit all of his assets, including this house. These papers are eviction notices, Rosa. You and Marcus have 48 hours to vacate the premises." The words hit Rosa like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand clutching Marcus's shoulder more tightly. The boy looked between the adults, his young mind struggling to process what was unfolding in his grandmother's living room. "I don't understand," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden roaring in her ears. "David promised me I would always have a home here. He said this was our family home, that Marcus would inherit it someday. There has to be some mistake." Victoria's smile was razor-thin. "I'm afraid there's no mistake. David left everything to me. I've been patient, Rosa, allowing you to stay here out of respect for David's memory, but I can't continue to subsidize your living arrangements. I have plans for this property." One of the sheriff's deputies stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, we're just here to serve the papers and ensure this is handled peacefully. You'll need to speak with an attorney about any disputes regarding the property." Rosa's hands shook as she reached for the documents, her 68-year-old fingers struggling with the unfamiliar legal terminology. 30 years of memories pressed down on her as she tried to make sense of words like probate, intestate, and rightful heir. This was the house where she had raised David after his father died in a factory accident. This was where she had celebrated Marcus's first steps, his first words, his first day of school. Every corner held a piece of her heart. "But the mortgage," Rosa said suddenly, grasping for any lifeline. "I've been making the payments since David died. I have the receipts, the bank statements. Surely that counts for something?" Victoria's expression didn't change. "You were making payments on my property, Rosa. Consider it rent for the last 6 months. Frankly, you should be grateful I didn't charge you market rate." Marcus tugged on his grandmother's sleeve, his voice small and confused. "Abuela, what does this mean? Are we moving?" Before Rosa could answer, Victoria had produced another set of papers. "There's also the matter of Marcus's guardianship. As David's widow, I have certain legal rights regarding his son's care and custody." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Rosa's protective instincts flared, and she pulled Marcus closer to her side. "David wasn't Marcus's father," she said, her voice stronger now, fueled by maternal fury. "Marcus is my grandson, my daughter Elena's son. David was his uncle, his godfather, but not his legal father. You have no claim to this child." For the first time since entering the house, Victoria looked genuinely surprised. She recovered quickly, but Rosa caught the flicker of uncertainty that crossed her features. "Nevertheless," Victoria said, "I'm sure the courts will need to review the boy's living situation once you're homeless. Child Services takes these matters very seriously." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Rosa felt her knees go weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had survived poverty, discrimination, the death of her husband, the loss of her daughter Elena in that terrible car accident 3 years ago, and David's sudden death 6 months later. She would not let this woman destroy what remained of her family. 48 hours, Victoria repeated, checking her expensive watch. "The moving truck will be here Friday morning to clear out any remaining belongings. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." She turned to leave, her heels clicking across the hardwood floors that Rosa had refinished by hand just 2 summers ago. At the doorway, Victoria paused and looked back, her expression almost thoughtful. "For what it's worth, Rosa, this isn't personal. It's just business. David left me this property, and I intend to make the most of it. There's a developer interested in this entire block. Your little house will be demolished within the month." The front door closed with a definitive thud, leaving Rosa and Marcus alone with the sheriff's deputies, who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the scene they had just witnessed. One of them, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes, approached Rosa gently. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I know this is a shock, but you should really get yourself a lawyer. Something about this doesn't sit right with me, if you don't mind my saying so. I've served a lot of eviction notices, and usually there's more warning, more process. This feels rushed." Rosa nodded numbly, grateful for his compassion even as her world crumbled around her. After the deputies left, she sank onto her sofa, the eviction papers scattered across her coffee table like debris from an explosion. Marcus climbed up beside her, his young face serious beyond his years. Abuela, he said softly, where will we go? Rosa pulled her grandson into her arms, breathing in the familiar scent of his strawberry shampoo. I don't know yet, Mijo. But we'll figure it out. We always do. But even as she spoke the words, Rosa felt a cold fear settling in her chest. She had less than $400 in her checking account, no family nearby, and now, apparently, no home. At 68, she was too old to start over, but for Marcus, she would find a way. That evening, after Marcus had reluctantly gone to bed, Rosa sat at her kitchen table surrounded by boxes of documents she had pulled from David's old desk. Birth certificates, insurance policies, bank statements, and legal papers created a paper mountain of her family's history. Somewhere in this maze, she hoped to find proof of David's true intentions. David had been her heart, the son who called every Sunday, who brought groceries when her arthritis was particularly bad, who had promised her again and again that she would never have to worry about losing her home. He had been suspicious of Victoria's motives from the beginning, Rosa remembered. There had been arguments, whispered phone calls, tension that David tried to hide but that Rosa's maternal instincts had detected. She's not who she pretends to be, Mama, David had said just weeks before his death, using the childhood name that always made Rosa smile. I need to talk to a lawyer, make sure everything is protected if something happens to me. But David's sudden death in that car accident had come before he could follow through on his plans. Or had it? Rosa's arthritic fingers worked through the papers methodically, searching for any clue that might contradict Victoria's claims. Bank statements showed David had been making payments on a life insurance policy, with Rosa listed as the beneficiary. There were medical records, utility bills, even Marcus's school enrollment forms, all listing this address as his permanent residence. Then, at the bottom of the largest box, Rosa's fingers found something that made her heart race. A business card, creased and worn, for Patterson and Associates, estate planning attorneys. On the back, in David's familiar handwriting, were the words, Updated will Safe Deposit Box, First National, Box 247. Rosa stared at the card until the words blurred with her tears. David had been planning to protect them. The question was whether he had succeeded before his life was cut short. The next morning brought no relief, only a parade of problems that seemed designed to break Rosa's spirit entirely. Marcus came down to breakfast with red-rimmed eyes, having spent much of the night crying into his pillow. At school, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, pulled Rosa aside with concerns about his sudden academic decline and withdrawal from activities. Marcus is such a bright boy, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice filled with genuine concern. But lately he seems distracted, anxious. Is everything all right at home? Rosa found herself unable to form the words to explain their situation. How could she tell this kind woman that in less than 24 hours, Marcus might be homeless? That his entire world was about to be turned upside down by a woman who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed? We're going through some family difficulties, Rosa managed to say. But we'll work through them. Mrs. Patterson nodded understandingly. If there's anything the school can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask. Marcus is special, Mrs. Martinez. He has so much potential. Potential that would be wasted if Victoria succeeded in her plans, Rosa thought bitterly. But she simply thanked the teacher and walked Marcus to his classroom, watching him disappear among his classmates with a heavy heart. The rest of the day passed in a blur of desperate phone calls and closed doors. Every lawyer Rosa contacted wanted a retainer she couldn't afford, every social service agency had waiting lists that stretched for months. By afternoon, Rosa felt the walls closing in around her with each passing hour. That evening, as she and Marcus ate a quiet dinner of sandwiches and soup, the sound of a key in the front door sent ice through Rosa's veins. Victoria entered without knocking, followed by two men in work clothes who immediately began measuring the living room. Just checking on your progress, Victoria said brightly, as if she were stopping by for a friendly visit. I wanted to make sure you understood the timeline. Rosa stood slowly, her dignity the only armor she had left. We understand perfectly. But Victoria, please, there must be some other solution. This house has been Marcus's only stable home since his mother died. Surely David wouldn't have wanted his nephew to be homeless. Victoria's smile never wavered, but her eyes grew colder. David's wants are irrelevant now. He's dead, Rosa. I'm alive, and I'm the legal owner of this property. I've already signed a contract with a developer. This house will be demolished next month to make way for a small shopping center. One of the workers looked up from his measuring tape, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation he was overhearing. Victoria noticed his attention and spoke louder, as if to ensure the men understood the situation completely. I tried to be reasonable, Victoria continued. I could have evicted you months ago, but I wanted to give you time to adjust to your new circumstances. Some people might call that generous. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, his backpack slung over one shoulder, homework in his hand. He stopped when he saw Victoria and the strange men, his young face registering confusion and fear. Why are they measuring our house? He asked Rosa in Spanish. Before Rosa could respond, Victoria answered in English. I'm having the house appraised for renovation, Marcus. Once you and your grandmother find a new place to live, I'll be making some improvements. Marcus looked to his grandmother for translation, and Rosa saw her own heartbreak reflected in his dark eyes. How could she explain to a 12-year-old that cruelty sometimes wore designer suits and spoke in polite tones? Pack your things tonight, Victoria instructed, checking her phone with casual indifference. The locksmith will be here first thing in the morning to change the locks. I can't risk any damage to the property before the renovation begins. As Victoria and her workers left, Rosa sank into David's old recliner, the one he had bought for Father's Day the year before he died. The house felt different now, contaminated by Victoria's presence and her plans for destruction. 30 years of love and laughter would be reduced to rubble for the sake of profit. That night, Rosa and Marcus packed their lives into suitcases and garbage bags, sorting through memories with the desperate efficiency of refugees fleeing disaster. Marcus carefully wrapped his school trophies in newspaper while Rosa boxed up photographs that chronicled a family's journey through joy and sorrow. Abuela, Marcus said as he folded his favorite Batman t-shirt, will we ever come back here? Rosa paused in her packing, a framed photo of David and Marcus at last year's school carnival in her hands. In the picture, David was laughing at something Marcus had said, his arm wrapped protectively around the boy's shoulders. It was impossible to look at that photo and believe David would have wanted this to happen. I don't know, Mijo, Rosa answered honestly. But I promise you this, we won't give up without a fight. Your Uncle David loved us, and he wouldn't have left us with nothing. We just need to find out what he really wanted. As Marcus drifted off to sleep that night, curled up on Rosa's bed because his own room was filled with packed boxes, Rosa made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out the business card she had found in David's papers and stared at it in the dim light from her bedside lamp. Tomorrow, she would find a way to get to that safe deposit box. Tomorrow, she would discover what David had really planned for their future. And tomorrow, she would begin the fight for their home, their family, and their right to exist in a world that seemed determined to erase them. But tonight, she held her grandson close and whispered prayers in Spanish to a God she hoped was still listening. The morning of their eviction dawned gray and cold, matching the despair that had settled in Rosa's chest like a stone. She woke before sunrise, having barely slept, and found Marcus already awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of someone far too young to understand loss but old enough to feel it completely. It's moving day, isn't it? He whispered. Rosa nodded, not trusting her voice. She had spent the night alternating between rage and despair, her mind spinning through scenarios that ranged from hopeful to catastrophic. In her darkest moments, she imagined Marcus being taken away by child services, placed in foster care while she became another elderly homeless statistic. In her brightest fantasies, David's mysterious safe deposit box contained documents that would reverse their fortunes and expose Victoria's lies. Reality, she suspected, would fall somewhere between those extremes. They dressed in silence, eating a breakfast of cereal and milk that tasted like cardboard in their mouths. Rosa had called in sick to her part-time job at the grocery store, knowing that searching for David's safe deposit box was more important than the $30 she would earn stocking shelves. She couldn't afford to lose the job, but she couldn't afford to lose this chance either. At exactly 9 o'clock, Victoria arrived with a locksmith and 2 moving men, her punctuality as ruthless as everything else about her. She wore a different designer suit today, navy blue with silver buttons, and her smile was as sharp as a blade. "Good morning," she said brightly, as if they were meeting for coffee instead of an eviction. "I hope you had a pleasant final night in the house. The new locks will be installed within the hour, so if there's anything you've forgotten, now would be the time to retrieve it." Rosa emerged from the house carrying 2 suitcases and a cardboard box filled with photographs. Marcus followed with his backpack and a garbage bag stuffed with his clothes. Their entire lives, reduced to what they could carry. "Where will you go?" Victoria asked, and for a moment her voice almost sounded concerned. "Almost. We'll manage," Rosa replied stiffly. She refused to give Victoria the satisfaction of knowing they had nowhere to go. The locksmith, a tired-looking man in coveralls, approached the front door with his toolbox. As he began removing the old locks, Rosa felt a piece of her heart break away. Those locks had protected her family for 3 decades. David had installed them himself when Marcus was just a toddler, wanting to make sure his nephew was safe. "The house will be empty by this evening," Victoria announced to no one in particular. "The demolition crew starts Monday morning. It's actually quite exciting, watching progress happen in real time." Marcus flinched at the word demolition, and Rosa saw his young hands clench into fists. At 12, he was old enough to understand that Victoria was destroying their home for money, but too young to understand how adults could be so cruel to each other. As the locksmith finished his work, Victoria handed Rosa a business card. "This is for a homeless shelter downtown. They have a family program, and I'm sure they'll be able to accommodate you both temporarily." The condescension in Victoria's voice was unmistakable, and Rosa felt her composure finally crack. "We are not homeless," she said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "We are being illegally evicted from our rightful home by someone who has no moral claim to it." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory beneath her polite exterior. "Moral claims don't matter in court, Rosa. Legal documents do. And I have all of those." With that, Victoria climbed into her silver BMW and drove away, leaving Rosa and Marcus standing on the sidewalk with their belongings scattered around them like wreckage from a shipwreck. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains, some with sympathy, others with curiosity, but none with offers of help. Mrs. Chen from next door finally approached, her elderly face creased with concern. "Rosa, what's happening? Why are there new locks on your door?" Rosa explained the situation in halting English, her voice breaking several times as she described Victoria's actions. Mrs. Chen listened with growing outrage, her hands fluttering expressively as she processed the information. "This is not right," Mrs. Chen declared. "David would never have wanted this. That woman is lying, I am sure of it. David loved you and Marcus too much." It was the first validation Rosa had received from anyone, and she felt tears of gratitude spring to her eyes. "Thank you for believing us," she whispered. Mrs. Chen looked at the suitcases and bags surrounding them. "Where will you stay tonight?" Rosa's silence was answer enough. Mrs. Chen immediately began speaking in rapid Chinese to her husband, who had appeared at their front door. After a brief conversation, she turned back to Rosa with determination. "You will stay with us tonight. Tomorrow, we help you fight this woman. My husband's nephew is lawyer. We call him today." Rosa wanted to refuse, to maintain her pride in the face of such devastating loss, but Marcus's hopeful expression stopped her. He needed stability, safety, and kindness more than she needed to preserve her dignity. "Thank you," Rosa said simply. "We are grateful." As they gathered their belongings and crossed the street to the Chen family's modest home, Rosa cast one last look at 1247, Maple Street. The house stood silent and empty now, its windows like closed eyes, waiting for the destruction that would come with Monday's dawn. But Victoria Sterling had made one crucial mistake. In her eagerness to claim her prize and humiliate Rosa in the process, she had revealed her true nature to the entire neighborhood. And in Rosa Martinez, she had chosen to battle a woman who had survived far worse than a cruel stepmother's greed. The fight for David's true legacy was just beginning. That afternoon, while Marcus played video games with the children, Rosa made the most important phone call of her life. With Mrs. Chen translating when her English failed her, Rosa contacted Patterson and Associates, the law firm whose business card she had found in David's papers. "My name is Rosa Martinez," she began when the receptionist answered. "I believe my son David Martinez was a client of yours. He died 6 months ago, and his widow is trying to evict me from our family home. But I found your card in his papers, along with a note about a safe deposit box." There was a long pause, then the sound of typing. "Martinez, yes, I see his file here. You said his widow is evicting you?" "Victoria Sterling. She claims David left her everything, but something doesn't feel right. David promised me I would always have a home, and he mentioned talking to a lawyer before he died." "Mrs. Martinez," the receptionist said carefully, "I think you should speak with Mr. Patterson directly. Can you come in this afternoon? This sounds like something that needs immediate attention." 2 hours later, Rosa sat in the downtown offices of Patterson and Associates, Marcus by her side, facing a middle-aged attorney whose expression grew more troubled with each detail of their story. James Patterson was a soft-spoken man with graying hair and the kind of lined face that suggested he had seen too much human cruelty in his career. "Mrs. Martinez," he said finally, "David was indeed our client. He came to us in September, about 2 months before his death, with very specific concerns about his wife's intentions and his family's security." Rosa's heart began to race. "What kind of concerns?" Mr. Patterson opened a file and pulled out several documents. David suspected that Victoria was planning to divorce him and claim half his assets, including the family home. He was also worried that something might happen to him, given some of the arguments they'd been having. He wanted to make sure you and Marcus were protected. "Did he update his will?" Rosa asked, hardly daring to hope. "He began the process, but unfortunately died before we could complete all the documentation. However, he did execute one very important document." Mr. Patterson handed Rosa a legal paper with David's signature clearly visible at the bottom. "This is a revocable living trust, naming you as the primary beneficiary of the house at 1247, Maple Street. It also names Marcus as the secondary beneficiary, to inherit when you pass away." Rosa stared at the document, the words swimming before her eyes. This means Victoria Sterling has no legal claim to your home. The trust supersedes any inheritance rights she might have had as David's widow. But there's more." Mr. Patterson pulled out another document. "David also left instructions for us to retrieve certain items from his safe deposit box in the event of his death. Items he believed would be crucial if Victoria tried to challenge his estate." Marcus, who had been listening quietly, suddenly sat up straighter. "What kind of items?" Mr. Patterson smiled at the boy. "Documents, recordings, photographs. Your uncle was a careful man, Marcus. He documented everything he needed to protect his family." Rosa felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed her. David had kept his promise. Even in death, he was still protecting them. But then reality crashed back down around her. "But we've already been evicted," Rosa said desperately. "Victoria changed the locks this morning. She's planning to demolish the house on Monday." Mr. Patterson's expression hardened. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Mrs. Martinez, what Victoria Sterling has done is not just morally reprehensible, it's criminal. She has knowingly filed false documents with the probate court and illegally evicted the rightful owners of that property." He reached for his phone. "I'm calling the court right now to file an emergency injunction to stop any demolition or sale of the property. Then we're going to retrieve David's evidence from that safe deposit box, and we're going to expose exactly what kind of woman Victoria Sterling really is." As Mr. Patterson made his calls, Rosa reached for Marcus's hand. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. David's love had transcended death itself, reaching out to save them when they needed it most. But even as relief flooded through her, Rosa knew this was far from over. Victoria Sterling had shown her true colors, and women like that didn't surrender easily. The battle for their home, their dignity, and their future was about to begin in earnest. And Rosa Martinez, armed with the truth and her grandson's future at stake, was ready for war. The emergency court hearing was scheduled for the following Monday morning, the same day Victoria's demolition crew was supposed to arrive. Rosa spent the weekend in a strange limbo, staying with the Chin family while Mr. Patterson worked around the clock to prepare their case. The safe deposit box had yielded treasures beyond their wildest hopes, recorded conversations, photographs, and most damning of all, a video David had made just weeks before his death. "If something happens to me," David's voice said from Mr. Patterson's laptop screen, his face serious but calm, "I want everyone to know that Victoria Sterling married me for my money and my property. She's been pressuring me to change my will, to cut out my mother and Marcus. She's threatened to leave me if I don't sign over the house to her immediately. But I won't do it. This house belongs to my family, not to a woman who sees dollar signs instead of love." Rosa wept openly as she watched her son speak from beyond the grave, his words a final gift of protection and vindication. Marcus sat beside her, his young face filled with a mixture of grief and anger as he listened to the uncle he had adored expose the woman who had stolen their home. But the video was just the beginning. David's safe deposit box contained a treasure trove of evidence, photographs of Victoria meeting with real estate developers while David was still alive, recorded phone conversations where she discussed her plans to get rid of the deadweight once she inherited everything, and most shocking of all, medical records suggesting that David's accidental death might not have been an accident at all. These medical reports showed David had been taking medication for anxiety in the weeks before his death, Mr. Patterson explained, spreading the documents across his conference table. But the toxicology report from his accident shows levels of sedatives in his system that were far beyond therapeutic doses. Someone had been drugging him. Rosa felt the blood drain from her face. "You think Victoria?" "I think Victoria Sterling is capable of anything if it serves her purposes," Mr. Patterson said grimly. "But proving murder is beyond the scope of this case. What we can prove is fraud, theft, and the illegal eviction of the rightful property owners." Monday morning arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if the weather itself was conspiring to bring light to their dark situation. Rosa dressed carefully in her best black dress, the same one she had worn to David's funeral, and helped Marcus adjust his tie. At 12 years old, he looked small and vulnerable in his borrowed suit, but his eyes held a determination that made Rosa's heart swell with pride. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Word had spread through the community about their case, and Rosa was stunned to see dozens of familiar faces in the gallery. Mrs. Chin sat in the front row with her husband, both dressed in their finest clothes. Behind them were neighbors from Maple Street, co-workers from Rosa's grocery store job, even Marcus's teacher Mrs. Patterson, who had taken a personal day to attend. But it was the presence of the media that truly shocked Rosa. Television cameras lined the back of the courtroom, and reporters with notepads filled several rows. Somehow, their small family tragedy had become a public cause, a symbol of something larger than themselves. Victoria arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers and wearing a black suit that probably cost more than Rosa made in a month. She surveyed the packed courtroom with surprise and what looked like genuine concern for the first time since Rosa had known her. Judge Margaret Williams, a stern-faced woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the court to order. "This is an emergency hearing regarding the property dispute at 1247 Maple Street," she announced. "I understand there are serious allegations of fraud and illegal eviction. Mr. Patterson, you may present your case." What followed was the most intense 3 hours of Rosa's life. Mr. Patterson methodically presented David's evidence, the trust documents naming Rosa as the rightful owner, the video testimony revealing Victoria's true motives, the recorded phone conversations, and the photographs of Victoria's secret meetings with developers. The courtroom was silent as David's voice filled the space, speaking from beyond death to protect the family he loved. Victoria told me that my mother was a burden, his recorded voice said. She said Marcus would be better off in foster care, that I was holding myself back by supporting them. But she was wrong. They're not my burden, they're my purpose. Rosa saw several jurors wipe their eyes as David's testimony continued. Even the court reporter seemed affected, her fingers pausing occasionally as if the weight of the words made it difficult to continue. But Victoria's lawyers fought back hard. They questioned the validity of David's mental state when he made the recordings, suggested that Rosa had manipulated a grieving man, and painted her as a calculating woman trying to steal property that rightfully belonged to David's widow. Mrs. Martinez worked as a housekeeper, Victoria's lead attorney declared, his voice dripping with condescension. She had access to David Martinez's personal papers, his computer, even his medication. Isn't it possible that she created these so-called evidence pieces to support her false claims? Rosa felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. The lawyer's words carried undertones she had heard her entire life, the suggestion that because she was an immigrant, because she cleaned houses for a living, because she spoke with an accent, she was somehow less trustworthy, less deserving of justice. But Mr. Patterson was ready. Your Honor, we anticipated this line of attack. I'd like to call our first witness, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, David Martinez's personal physician. Dr. Rodriguez, a distinguished man with graying temples, approached the witness stand with a thick file under his arm. His testimony was devastating to Victoria's case. David Martinez was my patient for over 10 years, Dr. Rodriguez said clearly. In the months before his death, he came to me with concerns about his wife's behavior. He suspected she was tampering with his medication, increasing his anxiety levels to make him more pliable to her demands. I advised him to document everything and consider legal action. The courtroom stirred with shocked murmurs. Victoria's face remained impassive, but Rosa noticed her hands clench into fists on the table. Dr. Rodriguez continued, David was completely mentally competent until the day he died. In fact, he had scheduled an appointment with me for the week following his accident to discuss having Victoria committed for psychiatric evaluation. He believed she was dangerous. Victoria's face had gone white, and Rosa saw her whispering frantically to her lawyers. But the revelations were far from over. Mr. Patterson called a parade of witnesses, neighbors who had seen Victoria meeting with real estate developers, bank employees who testified about suspicious financial transactions, even Victoria's own former housekeeper, who tearfully admitted that Victoria had bragged about getting rid of the old woman and her brat once she sold the property. She used to practice what she would say to David, the housekeeper, Maria, testified in broken English. She would stand in front of the mirror and say, David, your family is holding you back. You deserve better than taking care of dead weight. It made me sick to my stomach. But it was Marcus who delivered the most powerful testimony. At 12, he was old enough to testify on his own behalf, and his words carried the weight of absolute truth and innocence. Victoria never liked us, Marcus said simply, his young voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. She used to tell Uncle David that we were holding him back, that he'd never be successful with us around. She said my grandmother was too old and stupid to understand business, and that I was just another mouth to feed. The gallery stirred with outraged murmurs, and Rosa saw several jurors shake their heads in disgust. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he continued. But Uncle David loved us. He told me I was going to inherit the house someday, that it would always be our family home. He said Victoria could never take that away from us because family was more important than money. He said people like Victoria only knew how to take, but people like us knew how to love. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to her grandson speak with a wisdom far beyond his years. The ordeal had forced him to grow up too quickly, but it had also revealed the strength of character that would serve him throughout his life. When Victoria took the stand in her own defense, her polished composure began to crack under the weight of evidence against her. She denied the recordings, claimed the documents were forged, and insisted that David had left everything to her willingly. David was confused in his final months, she claimed, her voice tight with controlled anger. His mother and that boy had manipulated him into believing things that weren't true. I was trying to protect him from their influence, to help him see that he was being used by people who only wanted his money. The irony of her words wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Here was a woman who had married for money, accusing others of being motivated by greed. But Mr. Patterson was relentless in his cross-examination. He played the recordings of Victoria's own voice discussing her plans to evict Rosa and sell the property. He showed photographs of her celebrating at expensive restaurants while Rosa and Marcus were sleeping in homeless shelters. He presented bank records showing Victoria had already spent thousands of dollars from David's accounts on luxury items for herself. "Mrs. Sterling," Mr. Patterson said, his voice cutting through her stammered denials, "these records show that within 24 hours of David's funeral, you were meeting with real estate developers and transferring money from his accounts to your personal use. Does that sound like the behavior of a grieving widow?" Victoria's composure finally began to crack. "I had to protect my interests," she snapped. "David's family would have bled him dry if I hadn't stepped in. That old woman has been living off his generosity for years, and for what? So she could raise a kid who's not even his." The mask was slipping, and everyone in the courtroom could see the cold calculation beneath Victoria's polished exterior. Mr. Patterson pressed harder. "Mrs. Sterling, isn't it true that you married David Martinez specifically because you discovered he owned valuable property in a gentrifying neighborhood? Isn't it true that you never loved him at all, but saw him as a means to financial security?" Victoria's lawyer objected frantically, but the damage was done. Victoria's face had flushed red with anger, and when she opened her mouth to respond, the truth finally spilled out like poison from a broken container. "So what if I did?" she snapped, her voice rising to a near shout. "David was lonely, desperate for companionship. I gave him 2 years of marriage, 2 years of pretending to care about his pathetic family and their little house. I earned that property through pure endurance." The courtroom erupted. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, while Victoria's lawyers looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Rosa felt a mixture of vindication and horror as she watched Victoria's true nature finally exposed to the world. But Victoria wasn't finished. As if the dam had finally burst, years of carefully controlled hatred poured out of her. "Do you people have any idea what it's like to pretend to care about people who contribute nothing to society?" she continued, ignoring her lawyer's desperate attempts to silence her. The racist venom in Victoria's words hung in the air like poison gas. Several people in the gallery gasped audibly, and Rosa saw the court reporter's fingers freeze over her keyboard in shock. Even Victoria's own lawyers looked mortified by their client's outburst. Judge Williams's face hardened to granite. "Mrs. Sterling, you are in contempt of this court. Bailiff, please escort Mrs. Sterling to holding while I consider additional charges for hate speech and intimidation of witnesses." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about the injustice of her situation and the ingratitude of people who didn't know their place, Rosa felt a profound sense of closure. The woman who had tried to steal their home and destroy their family had finally revealed her true nature to the world. Can you believe the lengths some people will go to steal what isn't theirs? If you're as shocked as I am by Victoria's racist outburst, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments what you think her punishment should be. Some people's true colors are uglier than we ever imagined. Judge Williams recessed court for deliberation, but Rosa knew the outcome was no longer in doubt. Victoria had condemned herself with her own words, revealing the cold calculation and racial hatred that had driven every moment of her relationship with David and her treatment of his family. 2 hours later, Judge Williams returned with a verdict that would echo through the community for years to come. This court finds that Victoria Sterling knowingly and willfully committed fraud against the estate of David Martinez, the judge announced, her voice ringing with authority. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Martinez executed a valid trust naming Rosa Martinez as the primary beneficiary of the property at 1247 Maple Street. Mrs. Sterling's claims to the property are not only legally invalid, they are criminally fraudulent. The gallery erupted in cheers and applause. Rosa felt Marcus grab her hand, his grip tight with excitement and relief. Mrs. Chen was openly weeping with joy, and even some of the court officers were smiling. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court finds that Mrs. Sterling's illegal eviction of Mrs. Martinez and her grandson constitutes elder abuse and child endangerment. The emotional and financial damages inflicted on this family are severe and inexcusable, compounded by the racial animus displayed in this courtroom today. Rosa felt her heart pounding as the judge continued. Therefore, this court orders the immediate restoration of property rights to Rosa Martinez and Marcus Rodriguez. Mrs. Sterling is ordered to pay restitution of $75,000 for damages, emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages for her discriminatory conduct. Additionally, this court is referring this case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges including fraud, elder abuse, hate crimes, and conspiracy to commit theft. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity and healing. Rosa and Marcus returned to 1247 Maple Street to find that the house had been vandalized during Victoria's brief ownership. Windows were broken, walls were tagged with graffiti, and someone had poured concrete down the drains. But the structure was sound, and with help from neighbors and volunteers organized by Mrs. Chen, the house was restored to its former warmth within a month. Victoria was eventually sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud, elder abuse, and hate crimes. The real estate developers who had conspired with her were fined heavily and barred from operating in the county. The media attention had turned their small family story into a cautionary tale about greed, racism, and the power of standing up for what's right. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the change in Marcus himself. The ordeal had aged him beyond his years, but it had also shown him the power of truth and the importance of fighting for justice. His grades improved dramatically once he was back in his stable home, and he began volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other families navigate the complex world of property law. "I want to be a lawyer like Mr. Patterson," he told Rosa one evening as they sat on their restored front porch, watching the sun set over their neighborhood. "I want to help people who get pushed around by bullies in suits." Rosa smiled and squeezed his hand. "Your Uncle David would be proud. He always said you were going to change the world." 6 months after the trial, Rosa received an unexpected visitor. A young woman knocked on her door one morning, introducing herself as Sarah Sterling, Victoria's estranged daughter from her first marriage. "I wanted to apologize for what my mother did to your family," Sarah said, her eyes red with shame and exhaustion. "I've been trying to make amends to all the people she hurt over the years. I know it doesn't undo the damage, but I wanted you to know that not everyone in our family is like her." Rosa invited Sarah in for coffee, and over the course of several hours, she learned the full extent of Victoria's pattern of manipulation and abuse. Sarah's own father had died under suspicious circumstances when Sarah was just 16, leaving Victoria to inherit his considerable estate. Sarah had been cut off financially when she refused to lie for Victoria in a previous legal dispute. "She's a sociopath," Sarah said quietly. "She genuinely believes she's entitled to whatever she wants, regardless of who gets hurt. I've been in therapy for years trying to understand how someone can live that way. When I saw the news coverage of your case, I realized she had found new victims." Rosa found herself feeling compassion for this young woman who had been victimized by Victoria long before Rosa's family ever met her. They stayed in touch after that visit, and Sarah became something of an honorary family member, joining Rosa and Marcus for holidays and celebrations. The house at 1247 Maple Street was never quite the same after Victoria's reign of terror, but in many ways, it was better. The near loss of their home had strengthened the bonds between Rosa and Marcus, and had shown them both the power of community support. Neighbors who had been strangers before became close friends. The legal victory had given Rosa confidence she had never possessed before, and she began volunteering with immigrant families facing housing discrimination. Most importantly, David's love had transcended death itself, protecting his family through carefully planned legal documents and recorded testimony that spoke for him when he could no longer speak for himself. Rosa kept his video testimony in a place of honor in the house, playing it for Marcus whenever the boy needed to remember how much his uncle had loved him. Dear Uncle David, Marcus read aloud, his voice steady despite his tears. We won. We saved our home, and we saved each other. Victoria is in prison where she belongs, and everyone knows the truth about what she tried to do to us. But most importantly, I learned that love is stronger than hate, and that family isn't just about blood. It's about people who fight for each other, even when it seems impossible. Rosa wiped her eyes as Marcus continued. I'm going to be a lawyer, just like I told you I would. I'm going to help other families like ours, families that get pushed around by people with money and power. I'm going to make sure no other kid has to go through what I went through. As they walked back to their car, Rosa felt David's presence surrounding them like a warm embrace. The battle had been won, justice had prevailed, and love had triumphed over hatred. The house at 1247 Maple Street stood as a monument not just to their victory, but to the unbreakable bonds of family and the power of truth to overcome any lie. 2 years later, Marcus graduated as valedictorian and won a full law scholarship, dedicating it to his grandmother and late uncle. Victoria served 3 years before parole and later sent a letter admitting her crimes, ruining lives for greed, traumatizing Marcus, and betraying the man who loved her. She was in therapy, on medication, had earned her GED, and was studying social work. She didn't ask forgiveness, only hoped Rosa and Marcus found the happiness she once tried to steal. Marcus, now 19 in law school, said, "We forgive not for her sake, for ours." Rosa replied to Victoria, forgiving her but warning that forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. 5 years after their ordeal, Marcus was about to graduate law school and had been hired to fight for housing rights. Their case had inspired new laws protecting the elderly. As they sat on their porch, Rosa realized the battle for 1247 Maple Street was never just about a house, it was about justice, dignity, and the right to live without fear. Victoria had tried to erase them, but love, truth, and community prevailed. They hadn't just survived, they had thrived.